When 600 knights faced 40,000 Ottoman warriors on a sun-scorched Mediterranean island, few believed they would survive the summer. Yet what unfolded in 1565 would become one of history's most astonishing military victories, the Great Siege of Malta. The battle that saved Western civilization. The Mediterranean Sea, 1565. For decades, the crescent banners of the Ottoman Empire had swept across 3 continents like an unstoppable tide. Constantinople had fallen. Rhodes had fallen. Belgrade, Budapest, and 100 Christian cities had crumbled before the Sultan's armies. Now, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful ruler on earth, turned his gaze toward a tiny limestone island floating between Sicily and North Africa. Malta. A desolate rock barely 17 miles long, baked by merciless sun, surrounded by crystal waters that concealed deadly reefs. But this insignificant island held the key to an empire. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the Mediterranean. And whoever controlled the Mediterranean could unlock the gates to Italy, to Rome, to the heart of Christian Europe itself. The island belonged to the Knights Hospitaller, an ancient order of warrior monks who had been driven from Jerusalem during the Crusades, then expelled from Rhodes by Suleiman himself in 1522. For decades, these knights had transformed Malta into a fortress, and a thorn in the Ottoman side. Their swift galleys harassed Turkish shipping, capturing vessels laden with gold, silk, and slaves. Their raids humiliated the Sultan. Their very existence was an insult to Ottoman supremacy. By 1564, Suleiman's patience had evaporated. When the knight's most notorious corsair, Mathurin Romegas, captured a ship carrying the chief eunuch of the Sultan's palace, along with the former nurse of Suleiman's daughter, the aged Sultan's fury knew no bounds. He would wipe these Christian dogs from the face of the earth. Malta would burn. In the Grand Master's palace at Burgu, Jean de Valette received the intelligence he had long anticipated. His network of spies in Constantinople sent word, the invasion was coming. Spring 1565. De Valette was 70 years old, a scarred veteran who had spent 47 years in the order. He had been captured by Barbary corsairs in his youth and chained to an oar as a galley slave, feeling the crack of the whip and the bite of salt spray. He had fought at Rhodes. He had survived plague, battle wounds, and the political intrigue of kings. His face bore the weathered lines of 1,000 sieges, but his eyes burned with unshakable resolve. The Grand Master knew Malta's strategic nightmare. The knights numbered barely 600, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and German nobles bound by sacred vows. Supporting them were perhaps 1,200 Spanish and Italian soldiers, mercenaries of varying quality. Another 4,000 Maltese militia, farmers, fishermen, and townspeople who could handle an arquebus but had never faced the Sultan's Janissaries. Against what was coming, they might as well be armed with fishing rods. Intelligence suggested the Ottoman Armada would bring 40,000 men. 40,000. Elite Janissaries with their distinctive white caps and yataghan swords. Sipahi cavalry. Engineers who had reduced the mightiest fortresses in Europe. Cannons that could shatter castle walls like pottery. De Valette sent desperate pleas to the courts of Europe. King Philip II of Spain promised aid, eventually. The Pope offered prayers. Other Christian monarchs sent encouraging words and little else. Malta would stand alone. Through the winter and early spring of 1565, Malta transformed into a fortress. Every able-bodied man worked the stone. Fort Saint Angelo at Burgu's tip received new bastions. Fort St. Michael on the Sanglia Peninsula grew thicker walls. Most crucial was Fort Saint Elmo, a star-shaped fortress guarding the entrance to Grand Harbor, the island's beating heart. De Valette ordered the poisoning of every well outside the fortified towns. He commanded the harvest of unripened grain, denying the invaders any food. Every sheep, every goat, every chicken was driven within the walls. The knights would give the Ottomans nothing but rock and ruin. In the armories, blacksmiths worked around the clock. Cannonballs were cast. Arquebus cleaned and tested. Barrels of gunpowder stacked in magazines. Weapons that had tasted Ottoman blood at Rhodes were sharpened once more. The knights took confession. They wrote letters home, knowing many would never be read. They kissed crucifixes and swore oaths before God. The Mediterranean winter storms gave way to spring calms. Fishing boats reported sails on the horizon, dozens, then hundreds. Children were sent to the island's interior. Old men gripped swords they hadn't held in decades. Priests led prayers in churches packed with the faithful. On May 18, 1565, the horizon turned dark. At dawn, the Ottoman armada materialized like a nightmare made manifest. Ship after ship after ship, their sails blotting out the rising sun. The fleet stretched from headland to headland, 193 vessels in all. Galleys with bronze rams. Massive galleasses bristling with cannons. Transport ships groaning with siege equipment, ammunition, and provisions for a long campaign. Aboard the flagship stood 3 men who embodied Ottoman power. Grand Vizier Mustafa Pasha commanded the army, a veteran strategist with ice in his veins. Admiral Piali Pasha controlled the fleet, young and ambitious, hungry for glory. And coming from Tripoli was the legendary Dragut, the corsair whose name alone struck terror across the Mediterranean. At 80 years old, Dragut remained the Sultan's most fearsome naval commander, a man who had humbled Christian fleets for 4 decades. The ships didn't immediately attack. They circled like sharks, surveying their prey. From the walls of Fort Saint Elmo, de Valette watched through a brass telescope. He counted ships. Estimated troop numbers. His face remained impassive, but his heart must have trembled. The force before him was larger than any Ottoman army that had invaded Christian territory since the siege of Vienna. On May 19, the first Ottoman soldiers waded ashore at Marsaxlok Bay. The ground shook as 40,000 warriors disembarked onto Maltese soil. Janissaries in their flowing white robes and cylindrical hats, carrying matchlock muskets and curved daggers. Sipahi cavalry, their armor glinting, horses stamping nervously on unfamiliar ground. Sappers with pickaxes and shovels, ready to dig trenches that would snake toward Christian walls. Teams of oxen dragged massive bronze cannons, weapons that had shattered the defenses of Belgrade and Rhodes. Among the invasion force were adventurers from across the Islamic world, warriors from Algeria, Tunisia, Anatolia, and Rumelia. Some sought plunder. Others pursued paradise through jihad. All believed they served the greatest empire on earth, and that Malta would fall within weeks. Mustafa Pasha established his main camp at Marsa, near the Grand Harbor. Command tents rose like a city of canvas. Cook fires numbered in the thousands. At night, the Ottoman camp glowed like a constellation fallen to earth, visible from every Christian fortress. But almost immediately, cracks appeared in Ottoman unity. Mustafa and Piali clashed over strategy. The Grand Vizier wanted to march inland and capture Mdina, Malta's ancient capital, then attack Birgu and Singlia from the landward side. Admiral Piali disagreed. To anchor his precious fleet safely in Marsemzet harbor, protected from the lethal Sirocco winds, he needed Fort Saint Elmo neutralized first. Into this dispute sailed Dragut. The old corsair surveyed the island and sided with Piali. Take Saint Elmo first, he advised. It would fall within days, a week at most. Then the fleet would have safe harbor and the knights would be demoralized. It was a decision that would doom the invasion. Fort Saint Elmo occupied a narrow rocky promontory at the tip of Mount Sybaris, commanding the entrance to both Grand Harbor and Marsemzet Harbor. The fort was small, barely 500 paces across, with walls that seemed laughably thin compared to the massive bastions of Birgu. Its garrison numbered perhaps 150 knights and 600 soldiers. Against an Ottoman army of 40,000, it appeared indefensible. De Valette, however, had gambled everything on Elmo. He had moved half his heavy artillery into the tiny fort. He reinforced its walls and dug defensive ditches. Most crucially, he stocked it with Malta's most determined fighters, men who understood their sacrifice would buy time for the rest of the island. On May 24, Ottoman engineers began constructing artillery platforms on the heights overlooking Saint Elmo. They worked with terrifying efficiency, building earthworks and gun emplacements that crept closer to the Christian walls each night. By May 27, the bombardment began. The roar was apocalyptic. Dozens of Ottoman cannons, including massive siege pieces capable of firing balls weighing 160 pounds, opened fire simultaneously. The thunder echoed across the island. Cannonballs arced through the Mediterranean sky like falling stars, smashing into St. Elmo's walls with bone-jarring impacts. Masonry exploded. Dust clouds rose. The fortress seemed to disintegrate under the onslaught. For 16 hours each day, the bombardment continued. Ottoman gunners worked in shifts, ensuring the cannons never cooled. They fired chain shot to shred defensive screens. They fired explosive shells that burst among the defenders, scattering red-hot shrapnel. They fired stone balls that crushed men where they stood. Yet each morning, St. Elmo's banner still flew. The defenders became ghosts. They slept in brief snatches between bombardments. They ate standing up, swallowing hard bread and wine while debris rained around them. Surgeons worked in makeshift hospitals, amputating shattered limbs by candlelight. The wounded begged to stay at their posts. The dying asked only that their weapons be given to those who could still fight. Each night, small boats crossed Grand Harbor from Birgu, navigating by starlight. They brought fresh gunpowder, food, and replacement soldiers. They evacuated the wounded. It was a lifeline, and Dragut knew it must be cut. The old corsair ordered new batteries constructed on the heights surrounding Grand Harbor. Soon, Ottoman cannons commanded the water itself. The relief boats came under murderous fire. Oarsmen were blown apart mid-stroke. Boats capsized, spilling wounded knights into dark waters. Still the boats came. On June 3, disaster struck. A massive Ottoman assault captured St. Elmo's Ravelin, the outer defensive position. Turkish Janissaries poured into the ditch, scaling ladders appearing like a deadly forest against the walls. Hand-to-hand combat raged for hours. Knights in full armor wielded swords against Janissary yataghans. Arquebuses fired at point-blank range. Defenders poured boiling oil and flaming hoops down on the attackers. The Ravelin became a charnel house. By nightfall, the Ottomans had gained the position, but at staggering cost. Hundreds of their best Janissaries lay dead or dying. The defenders, though bloodied, still held the main fort. Within St. Elmo, morale began to crack. These men had endured 3 weeks of hell. The fort was rubble. Every parapet was pocked with cannonball strikes. The stench of death was overpowering. Supplies dwindled. Sleep became impossible. On June 8, the garrison commanders sent a desperate message to de Valette. The fort cannot be held. Request permission to evacuate. The Grand Master's reply was cold as Toledo steel: St. Elmo must hold. Relief is coming from Sicily. Every day you resist saves Malta. It was a lie. No relief was coming, not yet. But de Valette knew the strategic truth. Every day, every hour that St. Elmo survived bled the Ottoman army white. If Elmo fell quickly, Birgu and Sanglia would face 40,000 fresh enemies. But if Elmo held, if it could by just a few more weeks. Among Saint Elmo's defenders stood a young Spanish captain named Gonzalo de Medrano. During one assault, he personally cut down a Janissary who had planted the Ottoman standard on the rampart. In the same moment, an Ottoman arquebus ball struck Medrano in the head. He fell, the enemy banner still clutched in his dead hands. His sacrifice became legend. The defenders found renewed determination. On June 16, the Ottomans launched their fiercest assault yet. 10,000 men attacked simultaneously from three sides. Siege towers rolled forward, their tops level with St. Elmo's shattered walls. Ottoman soldiers poured across bridges dropped from the towers. The fighting became primordial, stabbing, biting, wrestling in blood-slicked courtyards. Everywhere, men died.